There we go. That's better. Thanks
So
for
it's got a bit
bearing
of a
with
tech
me.
blip at the beginning.
It wouldn't be a sort of guest speaker spot unless there was a tech blip, would there?
Not at all. I'm going to ask you as well if you wouldn't mind just a little brief intro again, just for people who are watching the video back.
I will do.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Simone. So thanks very much for having me along today to speak to you about the refresh of the Greater Manchester VCSE Accord. So my name's Emma. I work for an organisation called 10GM. We are a joint venture to support the local VCSE sector in Greater Manchester. Currently, we have 4 members, Bolton CVS, Salford CVS, Action Together, who are the infrastructure body who cover Oldham, Rochdale and Tameside, and MAC covering Manchester. But we also work with Sector 3 and other VCSE infrastructure organisations in various ways as well. So I'm strategic lead at 10GM, but I'm coming here in a slightly different capacity today because what part of my role is as one of the supporting officers for the Greater Manchester VCSE Leadership Group. So that is a group of VCSE leaders in Greater Manchester representing various parts of the sector. So we've got people representing equalities organisations. We've got people there as service providers. We've got people there representing locality and GM level infrastructure. So a real wide range of people. And part of my role is about supporting and driving forward the work of that leadership group, who are often described as a coalition of the willing. And that leadership group came together in 2017 at the same time. At the same time as a lot of the key devolution work started, and really that group was about forming that strong strategic relationship between the public sector in GM and the VCSE sector. So that's the kind of capacity I'm coming and speaking to you in today. So this is just what we're going to be talking about. So what is the GM VCSE Accord? Some of you might have heard of it, some of you might have not. We'll kind of go through that in a little bit more detail. We are here today because we are in the process of actually refreshing that Accord agreement. So really importantly, want to hear your opinions and views about what should be in that. I've got some draft content to show you, so really keen to get your feedback on that, about whether that kind of reflects what you'd like to see in terms of the relationship between the Greater Manchester public sector and the VCSE sector. I've got a bit of information about how this Accord agreement will be delivered once it's in place, and I'll try and leave as much time as possible for discussion, so it's not just me going through some PowerPoint slides, because that isn't necessarily very exciting. I'll start with a bit of background. I should just say, while I'm presenting these slides, because I can't see faces, because I've just got you all at the side, if there's anything you want me to clarify or you've got a question, just take yourself off mute and say something. I want to keep it really informal, so if there's anything you're not sure of, just pipe up, let me know. So a bit of background to our discussion today. The original Greater Manchester VCSE Accord was first published in 2017. It was a 5-year agreement between the Mayor of Greater Manchester and the VCSE sector. At the same time, there was another agreement, a memorandum of understanding, that was signed between the VCSE sector and the Greater Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership that had that specific focus on health and wellbeing in Greater Manchester. So effectively what you've had is 2 separate agreements with, two major parts of that GM level public sector, which kind of worked at the time, but actually with work being a lot more kind of collaborative and integrated between the public sector and the VCSE sector, it makes a lot more sense to just have a single agreement for that real clarity. And I think that real defined relationship between the public sector and VCSE sector. So what we're currently working towards, and this event is part of that process, is a new Accord agreement to replace both that original Accord and the Health and Social Care Partnership MOU. As an additional bit of background, the Greater Manchester VCSE Leadership Group, which I mentioned a minute ago, in 2020, that group published its VCSE policy paper, which was developed through quite a lot of consultation with the VCSE sector. So some of you may remember someone from the VCSE leadership group coming along and doing some engagement with you to try and develop that policy paper. But that policy paper is a 10-year vision to support, transform, grow the VCSE sector in Greater Manchester. And it looked at 5 key areas to build our sector capacity and to kind of set out a vision for a way of working with the public sector as well. So first of all, a programme to support the wider workforce, including VCSE staff, volunteers. I don't think that's meant to say carers. I'm not sure why it does, so apologies. But actually, you know, recognising that there is a need to nurture, invest in, support our workforce, both paid and voluntary. We know that particularly in the last 18 months, there's been really high levels of stress, a lot of burnout. You know, there's been a huge amount of focus, quite rightly, on the kind of impact of the pandemic on NHS and health and social care staff, but actually a lot of very similar feelings in the VCSE sector as well. So actually investing in and supporting the workforce is really important. The second area that was set out by the VCSE leadership group was working towards implementing the VCSE commissioning framework. So in case you're not familiar with this is a framework that was developed to set out what good commissioning and procurement with the VCSE sector looks like. And that's everything from your very minor, you know, small, quick grants programs right through to large contracts and procurement. But actually it was about setting out some clear principles of what good commissioning and funding of the VCSE sector looks like. And the leadership group's been working to get that adopted by individual localities and at a GM level since it was published last year. The third area was around promoting and cementing the sector role in early intervention, prevention and population health. So what I think of as the bread and butter of our sector, it's what we kind of do anyway. But certainly in terms of kind of funding and resourcing, I think there can be that quite short-term intervention approach, whereas actually you know, what's incredibly important is that resourcing and funding of prevention and population health work as a means of reducing inequalities experienced by people and communities. The fourth was around the VCSE role in the inclusive economy. So I know that you all at Sector 3 do a lot of work actually around around what an inclusive economy looks like and what a VCSE sector role is in that. So, you know, as an example, actually thinking about the VCSE sector as a significant employer and actually, you know, leading the charge with regards to ethical and good employment in terms of being a living wage employer. There was some research that was out last week that showed that 74% of the VCSE sector who employs paid staff is already paying the real living wage. So actually, you know, the VCSE sector is already kind of leading the way in terms of what ethical good employment looks like. But I don't think, again, that's always necessarily thought of when we talk about, you know, the economy and local economies in Greater Manchester. And then finally, the final kind of area of that policy paper was how do we build an integrated approach to working with and via the VCSE sector across equalities, boroughs, local communities, that wider VCSE ecosystem to address inequalities and the wider determinants of health as well. So something I think that's become kind of even more prominent as a result of COVID, as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of kind of events over the last 18 months that have brought that real need to address inequality to the forefront. So that's a little bit of background around the VCSE policy paper that was published in 2020. So that's just part of what is the kind of context and the background going into this new accord agreement. So this new agreement is being informed by a range of things. So first of all, that reflecting back, learning from those two previous agreements that I mentioned, learning from the last 18 months as well, the pandemic, the recent report about inequalities in Greater Manchester, that report of the GM Independent Inequalities Commission. There's also been the recent Michael Marmot report, Building Back Fairer in Greater Manchester, which really kind of emphasises, the work that needs to be done to address the deepening inequalities that we're seeing. We're also doing a range of engagement at the moment. So structure conversations with key stakeholders. This is one of those conversations. It's really important that the accord agreement is something that's co-owned by all parts of the VCSE sector, and it's not just a kind of dusty bit of paper that sits on a shelf for 5 years. It needs to kind of mean something. It needs to be something that's useful to you. And of course, there are also some kind of quite significant governance changes, particularly in terms of health and care with the creation of the Greater Manchester Integrated Care System. That means changes for some VCSE organisations with regards to commissioning. So, organisations who've previously been commissioned perhaps directly through the CCG might see that changing. So there's a lot to kind of take into account there as well. So that's just a little bit of background about how this new accord agreement is being informed by recent events, and kind of how we're working across the sector to try and make sure that this is something meaningful and useful. Okay, so on to the actual accord itself. I've kind of talked about this before, but the core purpose of the accord is a collaboration agreement between the Mayor of Greater Manchester, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and the new Greater Manchester Integrated Care System with the VCSE sector based on a relationship of trust. And effectively, what this accord is trying to do is it's trying to act as a framework to describe that VCSE sector role in the Greater Manchester strategy, which is also being refreshed at the moment, and the future integrated care system. So any of you working in the kind of health and care sphere will probably be aware of those changes to the health and care governance in Greater Manchester. So it's important that we have something which helps to define what that VCSE sector role is in the future delivery of healthcare as well. Then the scope, I think this scope point is really important, because it would be very easy to kind of bundle all things into this accord agreement. And actually what's certainly come through in some of the other engagement sessions is the need to be really clear that, the accord has a purpose, and that is setting out a framework for a strategic relationship between the public sector and the Greater Manchester VCSE sector. Now that is, it is incredibly important, but it's a small part of our work as a sector. Many of you will be involved in, national work and campaigns to influence policy or change public attitudes and behaviours. There's also, highly localised community development work, a whole range of things that our sector does, which aren't necessarily going to be completely captured in this agreement, and that's okay. It's about giving this agreement a clear scope and purpose. But it does cover all projects and programmes led by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Integrated Care System, and including collaborative work across districts. So I think what that is trying to say is, recognising that there are, different ways that relationships operate between the VCSE sector and particularly local authorities. So this isn't going to be a kind of one size fits all approach. Although the kind of GM leaders will all be asked to kind of sign up to this and approve this, it's not something that's going to supersede any local agreements that are in place. It's intended to be, complementary and something that's particularly focused at that Greater Manchester footprint level, as opposed to completely defining the way that, you are working with the local authority or working with, a primary care network at that more localized level, if that makes sense. Okay. What is the accord? Yeah, we've kind of covered this already. It's a three-way agreement between the combined authority, the integrated care system, and the VCSE sector. In this instance, represented by the GM VCSE leadership group. And in terms of timescales, this new agreement will be in place for a period of 5 years, commencing this October. So it's important that whatever is in this agreement has that longevity and has that kind of focus on where we want to be as a sector in 5 years' time. Okay, right, we're on to some actual draft content. So as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, we've done quite a lot of engagement sessions already. And so actually what you see here, in terms of the shared vision, has been adapted and changed based on based on some of the feedback that we've already had. So this first section, the vision, is, what is our vision for a good, strong, effective relationship between the VCSE sector and the Greater Manchester public sector? I won't read it out, but I'll just pause for a moment so that you can kind of have a quick read through of what's there, and we'll come back to this as part of the discussion. Or if you have any initial thoughts, please feel free to say them now, but I'll just pause for a minute. Okay, I'm going to move on, but don't worry, we will be able to come back to this as part of the discussion. So the next section of the Accord Agreement is around defining, the role of the VCSE sector. So again, it's not going to cover literally everything, because what I don't think is helpful is necessarily having reams and reams of paper describing that relationship. I think having something quite concise is important. But this section is aiming to just tell a little bit more of that story about the VCSE sector in Greater Manchester. So things that we've added in as a result of the feedback is actually highlighting the fact that 71% of the sector are constituted as micro organisations, so an annual income under £10,000, with the majority of organisations working in specific neighbourhoods or communities, as opposed to that GM footprint level. So something that came through really strongly was, this with the previous draft was this feels quite like it's focused on some of those bigger VCSE organisations. So what we wanted to do is actually highlight that the vast majority of our sector is, volunteer-led, volunteer-run, and actually a micro-organisation. And then secondly, to really emphasise the breadth of the work that the sector does. So actually, our sector covers skills, employment, health and social care, reduction of poverty, environmental and carbon reduction work, a huge diversity, and a lot to celebrate. So we wanted to make that really explicit in this agreement as well. So again, I'll just pause for a couple of seconds so you can have a read of that. Okay, thank you. And then the final section is actually aiming to set out some goals. So, you know, we've got this Accord agreement. It's a framework to describe how the VCSE sector and the Greater Manchester public sector is going to work together. So what does that actually look like? And again, we've quite radically rewritten this section. The feedback that came through really strongly from previous VCSE engagement sessions was, don't overcomplicate it. You know, speak in clear language, try and not get kind of bogged down in jargon or system speak. You know, have some really clear goals, have commitments that are relatable, whether you're you know, a very, very small micro organization right up to, you know, big providers working at a GM footprint, and really kind of emphasize the fact that the VCSE sector is already, you know, doing incredible things. We don't necessarily need to talk about transforming our sector. What we do need to talk about is transforming the relationship between the VCSE sector and the public sector. So there's 8 commitments altogether. These are the first 4. So the first one's talking about that overall goal of working in partnership between the public and VCSE sectors to achieve a permanent reduction of inequalities within Greater Manchester. The second one is actually embedding the VCSE sector as a key strategic partner. So I think that one's really quite focused on what we can learn from COVID, where actually it wasn't a case of, you know, the public sector is the funder and the VCSE sector delivers the services, but actually we need to work together to come up with interventions and programs to you know, improve the lives of communities in GM. The third one is around financial resilience. So again, lots of feedback that we just need to be really clear that the VCSE sector's had a pretty tough time. A lot of organisations have eaten into reserves if they have any in the first place, which is a whole other issue. So actually that kind of resourcing and sustainability of the sector is really important. The fourth one is around growing the role of the VCSE sector as an integral part of a resilient and inclusive economy. So that real focus on growing and supporting social enterprise, cooperatives, community businesses, and so on. And then the next 4 commitments, building on our strengths to build the best VCSE ecosystem. So that word ecosystem, be interesting to hear your thoughts about that, because there's a lot of language around this ecosystem in the VCSE policy paper that I mentioned, but actually what that's talking about is having good VCSE infrastructure. So having organisations like Sector 3 that can bring VCSE organisations together, provide that support, provide that peer networking and so on, and that needs to be sustainably funded as well. Commitment 6 is about co-design of local services. You know, not making co-design a kind of afterthought, but actually having that built into commissioning cycles, and ensuring that the VCSE sector is a significant part of co-designing those services. Commitment 7 is, you know, how do we build those relationships, not just between the VCSE and public sectors, but also the private sector as well. So what is the role of the private sector in supporting, you know, the VCSE sector to thrive? This one, you know, again, we had quite a lot of feedback that, you know, during the pandemic, more VCSE organisations were kind of building relationships with local businesses. How do we make sure that we don't kind of lose the good work that's gone on there? And then finally, putting in place a comprehensive workforce programme based on improving capacity, capability and employment standards across the paid and voluntary VCSE workforce. So, you know, as people working with VCSE organisations, often that role of kind of training and developing the workforce falls down the list, or actually, you know, it's the first thing to be cut when there are budget cuts up around, you know, training, nurturing and supporting our paid and voluntary workforce. And actually that's incredibly important, even more so after COVID. So that's where we've got up to at the moment with the 8 commitments. It looks quite different from where we started. So you're the first people to actually see this slightly rewritten one. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about particularly these commitments. Do these feel right? Is there anything, is there anything missing when we're thinking about what we want that relationship in the next 5 years to look like between the combined authority, the integrated care system, and the VCSE sector? Does this kind of, does this feel like it covers all of those areas we want it to cover? Have we successfully managed to speak in, clear language, or actually is there still jargon in here that you don't think really works? And so get your thoughts ready on that just before we open it up, because I'm really keen to kind of get to some discussion. You might have questions about how this agreement will be delivered. So there is a role for the Greater Manchester VCSE Leadership Group. So they will be taking responsibility on behalf of the VCSE sector to drive forward the Accord Agreement and the work to implement it. That doesn't mean that they'll be the only ones to kind of do this work or benefit from it, but they'll be the kind of the body that's taking responsibility, if that makes sense. And in doing that, being accountable to the wider VCSE sector for delivery of this agreement. To do this, there's going to be an implementation plan. So as I said, it's a 5-year vision, but actually we recognise that there's some quite big objectives. One of the first objective is achieve a permanent reduction in the inequalities experienced by people. To get from A to B, there's going to need to be some very kind of clear delivery plans, responsibilities, and actions. So to do that, there's going to be an annual delivery plan of activity. So how are we actually going to be doing, this commitment around co-design? And that's going to be reviewed every year and kind of tweaked or changed if we're making lots of progress, or actually if there's been a bit of a lull, actually working out why that is and what we can do to address it. There is a funding agreement attached to this. So the GMCA and the Health and Social Care Integrated Care System are funding the delivery of this implementation plan. And there are some governance arrangements that are being put into place to manage it. And as I said, that will be evaluated and reviewed on a regular basis. So that's enough of me. I want to hear from you now. A few kind of starter questions, but really these will all kind of merge into a discussion. But that description of the VCSE sector has that accurately described the role of the VCSE sector. Is there anything that you'd remove, change, or add? Is there under those commitments, are there any specific actions or activities that you think need to be in the implementation plan that details how we'll actually work towards those objectives? And do you think this is something that's going to be useful to you and your work? So some quite big questions there, but I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment to take any initial questions or reflections, and then I think it might be helpful to just go back to those commitment slides and have a look at the actual wording and see what you think about those. But I'll just stop sharing for a brief moment to take any initial thoughts. So just take yourself off mute or pop your hand up, and I'd love to hear from you. Go for it, Stephen. Kick us off.
Cool, great, yeah. So as I look at it, I think there is an explicit recognition of the VCSE sector here. And, the VCSE sector across history has always been, well, we're here, we're mission orientated, we see the need and meet it anyway, and lots of different diversity in the way that's carried out. And, obviously with the background of COVID and the pressures placed on local authorities and budgets, I think it is a really good time to reframe what that connection and commitment is on the big picture and on the local picture, as to what that specific agreement is like. So it does resonate with me. I think my concerns moving forward is some things around capacity within organizations, shared leadership, and sharing that learning. So for example, if I was to want to work in collaboration around a specific theme around disability or around tackling inequalities for that protected characteristic, you know, I could be doing that within the capacity of an organization on a local level, but then how does that resonate on a GM level? And who are those leaders within that to share that across 10 boroughs? So some great opportunities, but how that looks from the big picture to the local picture is still not that clear to me, but at least there's a recognition of this sector, which is fabulous.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Yeah, I think that's always going to be the challenge, isn't it, of how you kind of make agreements like this relevant at that, you know, localized level, and then how that translates to that GM wide learning. In terms of the actual themes or those different kind of areas of work, once we've kind of got some consensus around those commitments, the implementation plan is going to kind of cost out where, you know, how much budget is needed, you know, what resource is going to be needed against each of those commitments. So actually, you know, if we're talking about the co-design commitment, okay, so which organizations across the GM VCSE sector who are our, you know, experts with that real experience in co-design, how do we need to resource them to be a part of this work at a GM level? So that's absolutely part of the implementation plan. But what I'm kind of taking from what you've said, to try and summarize, is you think it's really important that that's kind of detailed about how different parts of the sector will be involved in the delivery of the work. Is that fair?
Yeah, to a certain or lesser degree. To give you an example, one example is, you know, in response to recovering from the negative impact of COVID, central government would dish out X amount of money to local authorities who have a specific time limited period to distribute that funds for the VCSE sector. But the VCSE sector already has its organisational plans and strategic objectives that suddenly it can't just put another thing on top to engage with its communities and residents and people who've lived experience. And that's what I mean about seeing things coming down the road and building that capacity, building that learning community. Because as much as there is a huge amount of will in the VCSE sector, if you stretch it too thin, then it becomes ineffective. And I think people want to do that advocacy and co-design really well, because we've always wanted people to listen in a real new renewed way, in a real new renewed commitment way. So yeah, it's just seeing that workforce and that capacity in organizations, from small organizations to large organizations, in a real tangible way. I don't have the answer until we step into it, but it's that flex in the system sort of things that we can contribute fairly and in the right way.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Does anyone else want to share some thoughts? Beverly?
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. The Transport for Sick Children has been involved in much of the development of the Accord, and going back many years, because the charity has a history of 40 years, and it's always been engaged in the local political network around as well. So, we're really aware of what's going on. We're already trying to undertake many of the actions that are coming out from the Accord before. There was a lot of information on that presentation, Emma. So, I would have to go back and kind of really read it and look at it before I felt confident to give a good opinion on this. But some things I feel that have already taken place. So like, for us, I have been engaging much of last year, but during COVID, because we were not delivering services, was spent actually engaging with all the local networks throughout Greater Manchester and making sure that the charity had a profile throughout all the 10 districts. And not, it was about adding our voice in there and also developing our service delivery as well. So that's been really good, and the forums have been good. Finding budgets are getting a little bit confusing at the moment. Once upon a time, it came from the clinical commissioning group, so we understood. But like now, they're just a delivery partner, and I'm assuming it's coming from the Health and Social Care Partnership. Some things I don't know, I just assume, and so budgets are always a concern, partly because the charities had quite a disrupted few years because of all the changes that have been going. So we've actually accumulated good reserves. Makes you a bit nervous, really, because that money has come from different districts. So like, every 10 district in Greater Manchester gives us a grant. Some areas not before, demand is low in Stockport and Trafford, for instance. So why I'm coming to the Stockport meetings really is to try and build it up. But demand is really high in Oldham and in Bury. Oldham in particular has been so adversely impacted on by COVID, and I know that. So, it makes me a bit nervous about our budget, our Stockport and Trafford going to say, well, we're going to cut back on you. And then we're not meeting anything from Oldham. So it's getting that Greater Manchester view in our budgets rather than us just having to be stuck on a district one. I'm just throwing that one in. What I mean, but and resources to support the development of the VCS. Of course, we're all going to be asking about that. What resources? It's been great. We've been working with Action Together. Sector 3 is quite a new one for us. Action Together have been great. Really well. Lot of capacity over there, and really helped out, and so it's developing all over Greater Manchester. We're really pleased to be able to put our voice into that, and also to hopefully, we've really supported the devolution cause all the way through, and and are really committed to improving the health of Greater Manchester residents by helping those. So those are just comments rather than anything. I look forward to spending a bit more time on the slides, then we're really getting a good feel for what's coming. But liking what I'm hearing. It's the most vocal support that I have personally seen for the VCS sector, but I have known, really. So yeah, very supportive of what's going on.
Thank you very much, Beverly. Yeah, and I won't say who it is, but there's one of the senior kind of stakeholders from the public sector who said basically what they want this to be about is a move from warm words to kind of actual activity and actual outcomes. So I think the previous accord and MOU did kind of set out a good direction, but what's been really clear, certainly from some of the other engagement sessions, is okay, well, I need to be able to see what's actually coming out of that work. So really, I think what's absolutely critical is that there are, some very kind of clear work streams and activities that sit under those commitments, because again, you run that risk of it being more warm words and not a lot of action. But yeah, absolutely everything you've said, that finding budget is getting confusing. I mean, the kind of stuff I hear about the development of the Greater Manchester integrated care system is still coming in dribs and drabs. I don't think there's necessarily that clarity for the VCSE sector about future contracts or grants, or are they moving? Is there certainty? Well, no, there doesn't seem to be. But now feels like an important time to kind of set out our intention as a sector and what we expect. So I think your points around you know, the fact that your funding comes from different districts and sources, and maybe actually a more kind of flexible funding package that sits across the 10, so you can kind of flex to demand, might be better. That, you know, that those are all the kind of things that I hope might come out in the implementation of this agreement. Would anyone else like to come in? If you want me to kind of pull up the slides again so you can go back and actually have a read of those, I'd happily do that as well.
Can we have the slides quite early? Can somebody send them out? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. I'll
That would
send
be
them
great.
out as soon as.
Another a slight problem that because we work across the 10 districts, I seem to be after going to 10 different websites, and it gets really difficult. And so, oh, I've lost you. Yeah, 10 different websites, and yeah, that can get quite complicated quite quickly when you're looking for one document. So thank you for sending it out to us. Great.
That's fine. Well, I'll arrange with Simone to get those out to you all, you know, as soon as we can after this discussion. Thinking about those shared commitments, does anyone have any kind of thoughts and comments on those? Do they feel strong enough? Are they ambitious enough? What were your kind of initial reactions seeing those 8 commitments? Feel free to just come in because I've lost all your faces again.
I think for me, it was quite good seeing the 8 commitments, but one thing that's clearly missing is finances. And I'm just wondering, how is all this going to be achieved if there isn't any mention of the word budget or finance? I mean, you did mention before that 71% of these groups have less than £10,000 income, a runabout sharing responsibilities, integrated system, which is basically people trying to be in the community and being independent. So I'm not sure how that's going to work. So I'm a little bit skeptical.
Thanks, Paula. Yeah, so interesting, because that commitment 3 is intended to talk about, you know, the financing and funding of the VCSE sector. But if you're not reading it that way, that to me says it's not clear enough. So actually, there's some, I don't know if I can stop sharing without losing this, but essentially there's a couple more sentences that sit under each of these commitments that say how we're going to do it. But effectively what that commitment 3 is trying to say is we recognize that you know, parts of the VCSE sector are quite financially fragile, as in existing year to year, hoping that contracts are going to be renewed, hoping that there'll be, you know, a grant funding from additional sources, hoping that, you know, we'll be able to kind of cobble together enough funding to see out the year. So that commitment is an aim to say, actually, you know, what we need is we need long-term funding programs. You know, we should be talking about 5-10 year contracts rather than sort of, oh, we'll potentially renew year on year. We need to be talking about, you know, sustainability. But actually, what you've just said indicates to me that that's not clear enough, and it should maybe be more explicit that commitment 3 is talking about the adequate funding and resourcing of our sector to deal with that huge challenge of ending poverty and reducing inequalities.
Yeah, I think that would definitely give people a bit more confidence. If it was a bit more in your face, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
You might not be able to see, but Parvin has a hand up.
Oh, Parvin, come on in. I can't see you. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. I think my question, or I don't know, statement, or however they call it, it's very well after Paula, because as I start to say something about my life and the memory I had, we as an organization, which is not just Bjorn, is a lot similar to us, we are not English speaker, and English is our second language. So it's difficult for us to read. The things has got that much academic work in it. Word it's not as such clear for us. I don't know, that's something deliberately happened to show the how demanding should be, and they want it in that way, or lack of over knowledge and academic background. And also when it's coming to writing is exactly the same. It for us is not something very easy to that much play with the word in different languages, and we seems write things much simpler, and a lot of our energy, time and money has to go for that. So I know in somehow we have to think about it. I can understand. But at the same time, maybe it's good if the people they are in that field also know that's something like for us, like an elephant in the room. And I think people has to be like me, a little bit shameless to talk about it. And myself, maybe because of my age, or I don't know, but I think it's easy for me to accept and talk about my limitation, but I am not seeing is not, I am seeing is not just me. It's a lot of little organization. They have that problem. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Parvin. Thank you. I'm really conscious of time. I know, Ian, you've got your hand up, so I just want to make sure we can hear from you as well.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I'm not speaking actually as a member of the Together Trust now. I'm speaking as a recently appointed trustee of a charity that supports women and men who've been subject to domestic violence. And the point you made on number 3 is really important here, because this organisation is absolutely hand to mouth on an almost 6-monthly basis, reliant on very short-term grants. You know, and it's shocking, really. Well, that's the biggest single shock I've had since I've joined as a trustee, actually, is around the finance. Because the organisation's been around 47 years, and yet it's just literally hand to mouth, year to year. So I do think if we can make the financial aspects of it more sustainable, it gives it a better chance. The big issue we've got, I'll be honest, is losing staff. People get contracts for 8-9 months, and then naturally after 6 months they're looking elsewhere, aren't they? So I was really pleased that you kind of explained what that number 3 commitment was, and I think that would certainly help that organisation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you. And yeah, that links to the workforce kind of point as well about retaining staff in the sector as well, doesn't it? Does anyone else who hasn't had an opportunity to say anything want to come in with anything? Just want to make sure everyone feels like they've been able to feedback. Just stop sharing for a moment. Any last kind of thoughts or comments?
Yeah.
Oh yes, go for it, Paula.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've missed this, or maybe it's there somewhere and I've misunderstood it, but I think you talked about the inequality side of things, and I'm hoping I would have seen something where there's a structure that shows more opportunities to increase diversity in the leadership of the in the communities across all the systems, especially in the BAME community, just strengthening the leadership there, because I think with that lacking, that's why some of the funding doesn't get to where it's supposed to go, and people haven't got the confidence to come forward and ask for things. And like Ian just said, there's lots of groups who are on shoestrings, and that's one of the things that's stopping them, because there is no leadership and they're not confident.
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, I think that's really, really important point. So sitting alongside this Accord development, there's also a kind of review of that GM VCSE leadership group and how it's working, and kind of what aspects of the current work should continue. One of the pieces of work that the leadership group's recently done has been a race equality action plan. So that's both looking at the kind of delivery of services in Greater Manchester by VCSE organisations for people experiencing racial discrimination, but also looked at that workforce and leadership aspect within the VCSE sector, some of the particular challenges that BAME-led organisations have had with regards to funding as well. So that, I think, is going to be a prominent part of the actual implementation, but that could probably come out a little bit more clearly in those shared commitments. Okay, right, I'm really conscious we're over time now. I really appreciate all of your thoughts. I've been scribbling down notes while you've all been speaking, so thank you very much for that. I will send the slides over to Simone because I realise there's a lot of information, so any kind of thoughts that you have, please do feel free to send them over to me, so I can incorporate them in the next version. I'll be taking all of this back to the VCSE leadership group, and we will be kind of getting back in touch with all local infrastructure organisations to kind of talk about how this is progressing, and it's not just a kind of one-stop engagement and move on, but actually how can we make sure that there's that engagement around this accord on an ongoing basis, particularly with the implementation as well. I'll pop my email in the chat as well, so if you've got any specific questions or there's anything you kind of want to follow up on separately, just drop me an email and we can set something up and have a chat. I know I've had a couple of DMs about various things while we've been speaking, so I'll pop my email in there. But otherwise, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it, and I'll just hand back to Simone to wrap up.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Emma, and for your time. And I suppose just a quick, for people who are watching this back on a video, do they have the opportunity to connect with you? Are you happy for me to share the email if they've got thoughts on the presentation?
Absolutely, yes.
Brilliant. Okay, we will do that. Yeah, so thanks everyone for attending as well. Yes, thanks Stephen for your note in the chat, and that's really important to us, I suppose, as Sector 3, to make sure that we keep following up with all the work that's happening across GM and make sure that Stockport's voice is heard in all of that. So please keep connecting and engaging with us about how we can do that better, or more of it, or in different sections where we're not included. Thanks for your time today. If anyone needs to connect with us, it's info@sector3sk.org, and I will send the slides out now. I don't have, obviously, because we don't register for this session, individual emails, so I was going to send the slides out, Emma, to everyone who's registered for the bulletin. Does that work okay for you? And then put in with that if they would like the link to watch the video back, to get in contact with us, and then maybe that's a way that we can work that out. Is that okay? Thanks very much for your time. Thank you.